After Megadeth finally breaking huge ground with Peace Sells But Who's Buying, they quickly entered the studio to record the follow-up, So Far, So Good, So What. During the period between Peace Sells But Who's Buying and said album, there was a bit of a lineup change. Gar Samuelson and Chris Poland were fired from the band and replaced by drummer Chuck Baylor and guitarist Jeff Young. Now, these two would only remain in the band for this album. But So Far, So Good, So What, to me, out of the classic Megadeth albums, is probably the weakest. And it's not... The primary culprit for why I believe this is not in the composition of the album, it's with the production of this album. I'm speaking, of course, about the original, not the remastered. The remastered version actually makes this album a lot better, and I know a lot of people would probably disagree with me on that. Granted that the 2004 remasters that Mustaine went back and did, most of them really aren't that good, but then there are only 2 albums that I can think of that he actually did remaster, that the remaster was necessary. This was one of them. So Far, So Good, So What, in the original production, had a massive problem in the mix. To me, the drums were way too loud, especially the snare drum. Not loud in the sense of Saint Anger where it's annoying, it's just really loud and drowning out everything else. But tracks on this album, Into the Lungs of Hell, Set the World Afire, great openers to this album, but I think my main problem with this album is that there are maybe a couple of tracks that I could take away from this album and actually have a decent... The album is full of filler. That's what I'm trying to get at here. This album is chock full of filler. Anarchy in the UK, the Sex Pistols cover, filler. Mary Jane, filler. 502, filler. Liar. I like Liar, but still, it's filler. The only tracks that I could take away from this album that I listen to on a regular basis are Into the Lungs of Hell, In My Darkest Hour, which is a fan favorite, and Hook and Mouth. And I know a lot of people do praise this album. This was the first Megadeth album that when it was released went platinum. Peace Sells went platinum a few years, I think maybe about a year later or something like that. But this was the first album where they actually got a lot of success off of album sales. And, you know, more power to them, but this is just an album to me that I don't enjoy, mostly due to the production. Now, if you get the remastered copy, which I'm a proud owner of the 2004 remaster of So Far, So Good, So What, and I prefer it over the original, then go ahead, pick that one up if you want to listen to the original copy. I'm sure you can listen to a couple of tracks off of YouTube to understand what I'm talking about. But I don't know whether or not it was the fact that it was new personnel that were hired onto this album and they really didn't have much material to bring to the table, or it was the fact that the drugs. Who knows? But then again, Mustaine also wrote some of his best material while inebriated and intoxicated and high. But it just, to me, So Far, So Good, So What seems like the oddball of the bunch. Solo work by Jeff Young is... you have some good solos in here, mostly found in My Darkest Hour has a great solo. I enjoy the track Liar. Out of all the tracks that I'm talking about here, Liar is definitely a highlight for me because this was a song that Mustaine had wrote about Chris Poland. Now, Chris Poland was a drug addict, heroin addict, and he would take the band's gear and he would pawn it off to get money for drugs. The song Liar is basically a giant middle finger to Chris Poland. And the song is almost comical in the fact that there is a section where Mustaine is rattling off all these insulting adjectives at the speed of light. And I will admit, that takes some skill. And I've seen some videos of him playing this song live, and for him to do it live, granted he's got the lyric sheet down here in the corner that he can read off, it's still impressive to see him read all of that off so quick live. If I can't see myself recommending this album to somebody who's trying to get into Megadeth. Peace Sells would be a much better bet to try to get somebody into Megadeth, or Rust in Peace, which that one's coming up next, and that's probably the most anticipated out of this discography is me harping about how great Rust in Peace is. But you know, Rust in Peace does have its faults, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow. But first, to close out So Far So Good So What, is this a bad album? Not in the slightest. This isn't the worst album that Megadeth has ever come out with. And no, their worst album is not Risk. That's not what I'm talking about. Anyway, So Far So Good So What? Is it good? And there's a couple of songs in here. Is it bad? Production-wise, yeah, but the material in here, it's pretty solid. And it gets about an above-average score for me, which would be a 6.5 out of 10. So out of all the classic Megadeth albums, this is by far, in my opinion, the weakest. So 6.5 out of 10 for me. Tomorrow, we're going to have a look at Rust in Peace. And I'm going to make my subscribers debate Rust in Peace tomorrow, because I have a lot to say about this album.